All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're going to look at how an American religious movement survived what honestly seemed like a completely fatal public defeat. And how did they do it? Well, they essentially went underground and built a massive hidden infrastructure. It's just a truly fascinating look at how ideas evolve into impenetrable institutions. And, it's an unbelievable historical plot twist.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with Revival Meets Challenges, then look at the 5 points, the infrastructure fortress, key shapers, and finally, the Scopes trial collision.
Section 1. Revival Meets Intellectual Challenges.
To really set the stage, we have to look at this critical window right between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the start of World War I in 1914. This was an era of just immense change. The American religious landscape was experiencing major tectonic shifts. On one hand, you've got these booming, down-home Protestant revivals led by guys like Dwight L. Moody. He was injecting this incredible energy into the church, bringing unmatched organizational skills and a massive focus on missions. But right at the same time, 4 huge intellectual and cultural challenges were basically crashing into the church. You had new scientific thought, most notably Darwin's theory of evolution, totally challenging traditional biblical creation narratives. You had historical thought questioning the literal historical existence of Jesus. Then there was this intense biblical criticism taking root in elite seminaries, scrutinizing who actually authored these sacred texts. And finally, you had the rising cultural challenge of Roman Catholicism, fueled by waves of immigration, growing incredibly fast and proclaiming new doctrines like papal infallibility. These were intimidating, massive threats that deeply confused the Protestant majority. They were so used to being the undisputed cultural default in America, and suddenly everything was changing.
Now, Protestants didn't just throw their hands up and surrender to these intellectual waves. They reacted systematically over decades. Moving on from those massive summer revivals, leaders started to realize that, hey, emotional fervor just isn't going to cut it anymore. They needed a rigorous, rock-solid intellectual foundation if they were going to survive. So this led to a super pivotal gathering in 1895 at the Niagara Falls Conference. This was not a relaxed retreat, okay? It was basically a war council. Theologians started hashing out point by exact point what they believed and what lines absolutely could not be crossed. And this multi-decade, highly organized response finally culminated in 1915 when they launched a widely distributed, super influential journal called The Fundamentals. And yeah, as you might have guessed, that's exactly where the name of the movement comes from.
Section 2. The 5 Points of Fundamentalism.
To defend their faith, they didn't just build this vague, fuzzy wall. No, they established 5 highly specific, highly defensible doctrines to directly counter modern intellectualism. First up, the inerrancy of scriptures, meaning they believe the biblical text is literally without error in all its teachings. Second, they affirmed the virgin birth of Jesus, directly pushing back against skeptics who claimed he was just a natural-born moral teacher. Third, they defended a literal physical resurrection, completely refusing to accept it as some sort of spiritual metaphor. Fourth, they stood firmly by the strict historical authenticity of the gospel narratives. And fifth, and this one is critical, they championed supernatural substitutionary atonement.
What's genuinely fascinating is why they drew such a hard line in the sand over that specific concept, substitutionary atonement. Why does this matter so much? Well, liberal critics at the time were starting to claim that the cross was really just a political execution by the Romans, totally devoid of any supernatural saving power. To those critics, Jesus was just a political martyr. But the fundamentalists saw this as completely gutting the core of Christianity. So they insisted, absolutely, that Christ died as a literal substitute for sinners, taking their sins upon himself on the cross. It became the absolute core of their defense against modernization.
Section 3. Building the Infrastructure Fortress.
But here's the thing about abstract theological ideas. They need actual, physical support to survive cultural storms. You can't just write some beliefs on paper and expect them to weather an intellectual hurricane. They knew they couldn't just preach. They had to institutionalize. And wow, did they ever. They poured immense resources into creating this self-sustaining ecosystem designed to protect those 5 points. We're talking massive training centers like the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, Biola in LA, and Gordon College. They set up an extensive circuit of summer prophetic conferences to keep the base fired up. They built these vast parachurch networks, which are basically Christian organizations that operate completely outside of any specific church denomination. This meant they could reach high school and college kids directly, totally bypassing church politics. Plus, they built enormous publishing operations to pump out tracts, Bibles, and magazines by the millions. Brick by brick, they were quietly building an impenetrable fortress.
And their use of technology is just incredible. When radio first came along, a lot of fundamentalists were absolutely terrified of it.
Because the Bible refers to Satan as the prince of the air, some folks literally believed these invisible radio waves were controlled by the devil. It was seen as this terrifying new frontier. But the savvy ones quickly realized this new medium was basically the Wi-Fi of the Dark Ages. They completely embraced these huge wooden living room radios. Why? Because it let them bypass traditional media gatekeepers altogether. Instead of fighting for tiny column inches in liberal newspapers, they were beaming their unedited message directly into the homes of massive new audiences all across the country. Almost overnight, they built a fiercely loyal national following.
Section 4. Key shapers of the movement.
You know, it's a pretty common misconception that the people who shaped this movement were just this monolith of angry, anti-intellectual brawlers. But the reality is way more nuanced. Take A.J. Gordon, for example. He was a fundamentalist, sure, but he wasn't a fighting fundamentalist. He was this peaceful, graceful leader who was deeply focused on holy living, ethics, and foreign missions, rather than just endlessly arguing with other denominations. And then you jump forward to figures like Francis Schaeffer. He was a really broad-minded intellectual who actually engaged deeply with heavy 20th century philosophy and art. He even set up this place called L'Abri in the Swiss Alps, which functioned sort of like an intellectual commune. It became this bustling refuge for doubting college students who just needed a sophisticated, philosophically rigorous defense of their faith, usually over a warm cup of coffee. So yeah, the movement had its deep thinkers and its saints, not just debaters.
Section 5. The Scopes Trial Collision.
Eventually, all of this theological firming up and massive institutional building was bound to violently collide with mainstream American culture. And that cultural explosion finally happened during the sweltering summer of 1925, down in Dayton, Tennessee. The state legislature had just made it literally unlawful to teach Darwin's theory of evolution in any tax-supported school. They decided the only acceptable science curriculum for human origins was the biblical creation story. Well, a young high school teacher named John T. Scopes decided to teach evolution anyway, completely intentionally testing the law. His arrest set the stage for what would instantly become the very first truly national media circus of the 20th century.
Now that were not just a couple of small-town lawyers arguing over a high school textbook. The claustrophobic Tennessee courtroom, literally baking in the July heat, became a battleground for two of the absolute biggest heavyweights in the entire country. Defending the state law and essentially representing the entire fundamentalist cause was William Jennings Bryan. He was a towering figure, a former U.S. Secretary of State and a three-time presidential candidate. Fighting to demolish the law was Clarence Darrow, who was arguably the most famous, brilliant, and ruthlessly agnostic defense lawyer in America at the time. Outside the courthouse, it was pure carnival. Street vendors, preachers, protesters, even actual monkeys were brought to town for photo ops. Meanwhile, the whole nation was just glued to their radios, listening with bated breath as these two titans clashed over the very origins of humanity.
So after this grueling summer trial, where people are literally fanning themselves, trying not to pass out from the heat, and the media is scrutinizing every single syllable spoken, we really have to ask the ultimate question. Who actually won?
Well, the outcome was basically a two-sided coin. Legally speaking, the fundamentalists won. The jury found Scopes guilty in a matter of minutes, and later, in 1927, the Supreme Court actually upheld the anti-evolution law. They won the specific battle they set out to fight. But culturally, oh man, they suffered a catastrophic decades-long PR defeat. There's this shocking moment in the trial where Clarence Darrow actually called William Jennings Bryan himself to the stand as an expert on the Bible. Darrow just ruthlessly cross-examined him, poking holes in his strict literalist interpretation of Genesis. Bryan looked flustered, confused, and just unable to answer basic scientific questions. The general public reading these blistering newspaper reports started universally viewing fundamentalists as out-of-step, anti-intellectual hicks. Mainstream culture largely stopped taking them seriously as an intellectual force right then and there.
The national reporters triumphantly packed up their bags, left Dayton, and literally declared it the permanent funeral of fundamentalism. They confidently assured the American public that this backward group would never, ever be heard from again. But they made a massive historical miscalculation. It's wild to think about, but they completely failed to reckon with that hidden institutional infrastructure we talked about earlier. Because while the mainstream culture mocked them relentlessly, the fundamentalists simply retreated. They just went back to their heavily funded Bible schools, their booming printing presses, their massive parachurch networks, and their totally unregulated radio broadcasts. They easily survived the cultural winter because their supply lines were 100% independent of the mainstream establishment.
So I'll leave you with this to consider. If cultural power is truly sustained not by winning popularity contests in the media, but by the physical supply lines and educational networks you build silently behind the scenes, what modern movements are building their own invisible fortresses right now, just waiting for their moment? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I'll catch you next time.